May 22, 1946. Punkrak Prison, Prague. More than 5,000 people watch in silence. In the center of the courtyard, a man climbs the gallows. Among the crowd, 7 women who survived Lidice await the moment they had waited years to see. His name was Karl Hermann Frank. To the Czechs, he symbolized terror. To history, he was one of the Nazi regime's cruelest collaborators. Now, at 48, he faced justice, yet he remained fanatical until death. Stay until the end to hear the dark words he shouted before he died. Before we begin, we are working toward 1 million subscribers. It may seem distant, but with your help, we can get there. Subscribe now, leave a like, and be part of this story. The birth of a monster. Early years. Karl Hermann Frank's story began on January 24, 1898, in Carlsbad, now Karlovy Vary, an elegant spa town in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Amid Baroque facades and medicinal springs, ethnic nationalism was growing among the local Germans. His father, Heinrich Frank, a stern nationalist teacher, fostered the idea that the Sudeten Germans were superior and oppressed by a decaying monarchy. Karl grew up surrounded by talk of race, identity, and destiny. He came to believe that Germany was his homeland by blood and the only power capable of restoring order to the world. At the age of 9, a childhood accident marked him for life. A stone struck his right eye, leaving him blind in it and forcing him to wear a glass prosthesis. It gave him a cold stare that reflected the lack of empathy that would define him as an adult. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Frank tried to enlist but was rejected because of his eye disability. The humiliation strengthened his belief that the system was against him. In 1918, the war ended, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and Czechoslovakia was created. To Frank, the new multi-ethnic republic was an insult. Germans had been pushed into the background. His radicalization began there. In 1919, he joined the German National Socialist Workers' Party, a Sudeten separatist party that called for annexation to Germany and preached Aryan racial superiority. Consumed by the doctrine, he opened a bookstore in 1925, specializing in National Socialist literature, spreading ideas, fear, and hatred while selling an identity. His fanaticism hardened with Hitler's rise in 1933. Nazism spread through the Sudetenland, and in 1938, under the Munich Agreement, the region was handed over to Germany, disregarding the Czechoslovaks. Frank celebrated. He was promoted to Reich Deputy and Gauleiter, officially joining the Nazi Party and, shortly afterward, the SS. His dream of power was finally coming true, but Hitler wanted more: the invasion of Czechoslovakia. On the 15th of March, 1939, completely disregarding the agreements made in Munich only 6 months earlier, Nazi Germany showed its true face. Wehrmacht troops crossed the borders and occupied what remained of Czechoslovakia without significant resistance. That gray morning, German armored vehicles rolled through the streets of Prague, while the stunned and helpless population watched their young republic collapse. Hitler himself arrived in the Czech capital the following day. He took up residence at Prague Castle, a symbol of Czech sovereignty, and from there proclaimed the creation of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. It was the end of Czechoslovakia as an independent state. The Nazi occupation had officially begun, a new chapter of domination, violence, and repression. Karl Hermann Frank, until then an ardent advocate of the annexation of the Sudetenland, was rewarded with even greater power. Promoted to the rank of SS Gruppenführer, equivalent to a major general, he also became State Secretary of the Protectorate. But his power did not end there. Shortly afterward, Heinrich Himmler, his superior and the architect of the Nazi repressive machine, entrusted him with supreme command of the SS and police in the region. It was more than a post. It was a dark throne over a land ruled by fear. With this appointment, Frank directly controlled every instrument of Nazi terror in the Protectorate, including the Gestapo, responsible for political repression, the Kripo, the criminal police, and the SD, the Nazi Party's intelligence service. Every arm of the beast was under his command. His first target was immediate, the Jewish community. More than 118,000 Jews lived in the newly occupied territory. With cold, bureaucratic precision, Frank began a systematic process of exclusion. Banks were forced to freeze accounts. Jewish businesses and shops were closed or forcibly transferred. Homes, buildings, works of art, personal belongings, everything was confiscated under a veneer of legality. The total value of property stolen from Jews is estimated to have exceeded $500 million at the time, equivalent to more than $11 billion today. And this was not the work of an automated system. Frank did not delegate. He kept close watch and supervised it personally. He signed every decree with his own pen, reviewed reports with clinical precision, and drafted orders with the coldness of a man who saw numbers, not lives. His office in Prague was not merely a government department. It was the command center of an extermination system disguised as public administration. There, persecution was calculated, planned, and carried out with German efficiency and absolute cruelty. Yet, as dark as all this seemed, it was only the surface. The true descent into the abyss would begin soon after, with the arrival in Prague of an even more ruthless man, an architect of death, capable of turning silence into a weapon and fear into state policy. The Reign of Terror, Heydrich's arrival. In September 1941, Hitler lost patience with the slow pace of repression in occupied Czechoslovakia. Strikes, subversive leaflets, and sabotage threatened essential factories and railways. To him, Konstantin von Neurath was far too soft. It was time for someone ruthless. On the 29th of September, the Führer appointed Reinhard Heydrich acting Reich Protector. The occupation had entered a new phase, rule with an iron fist. Heydrich, an architect of the Holocaust and Himmler's right-hand man, arrived in Prague with a clear mission: crush the resistance, accelerate Germanization, and secure war production at any cost, he declared. Coldly, he added, "We will Germanize the Czech insects." His relationship with Karl Hermann Frank began tensely, with two predators wary of one another. But they soon joined forces. Heydrich brought strategy and method. Frank brought local knowledge, political influence, and practical brutality. Together, they unleashed systematic terror. In October 1941, the first mass deportations of Jews from the Protectorate began, initially bound for the Lodz ghetto. On the 3rd of November, the first train carried 5,000 people. Only 277 would survive the war. Frank organized the logistics as if it were a commercial operation. Trains, schedules, quantities, human beings, everything was recorded with precision. That same month, Heydrich authorized the Theresienstadt ghetto, promoted as a model colony, but in reality an antechamber to death. Frank ensured that the transports began immediately. Families were dragged from their homes at night. Children wept. Elderly people were rushed along by dogs and rifles, all before impassive soldiers. In the first 5 months of the administration, between 4,000 and 5,000 people were arrested. Between 400 and 500 were summarily executed. Frank commanded with cold detachment. Kill first, we'll investigate later. But as history shows, even the cruelest sometimes encounter resistance. The death of Heydrich. As the Nazi occupation tightened its grip, 2 Czechoslovak paratroopers trained by the British Army had already been dropped back into their occupied homeland. Their names were Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš. Their mission: to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1942, Heydrich was traveling to his office in his unescorted Mercedes convertible, far too confident. As he rounded a bend in Prague, Gabčík tried to fire a submachine gun, but it jammed. Heydrich ordered his driver to stop. At that moment, Kubiš threw a homemade grenade. The blast struck Heydrich directly. Metal fragments and pieces of upholstery penetrated his spleen, diaphragm, and lungs. Heydrich survived the initial explosion. On the 3rd of June, he sat down to eat as though nothing had happened. Hours later, he collapsed. The infection had spread. He died the following day, the 4th of June, 1942. Nazism's chief executioner was dead, but the price would be exacted with interest in innocent blood. As soon as he learned of the attack, Frank declared a state of emergency. Prague was placed under curfew. Not a soul was allowed on the streets after sunset. Posters were put up across the city with a clear threat. Anyone who assisted the perpetrators would be executed along with their family. A manhunt began. Some 21,000 soldiers and police officers searched 36,000 homes. Arrests, interrogations, and torture continued day and night. By June 4th, 157 people had already been executed without trial, without evidence, without appeal. But Frank wanted more: punishment. On June 9th, as Heydrich's funeral was taking place in Berlin, Hitler summoned the regime's leading figures. He demanded an exemplary punishment. An entire village would be wiped off the face of the earth, a message that any resistance would be crushed with medieval ferocity. Hitler's orders were direct. Every man in the village was to be executed, every woman deported to concentration camps. The children were to be selected. Those deemed suitable for Germanization would be handed over to SS families. The rest would be killed. The village would be reduced to ashes. Frank listened to these words with a sadistic gleam in his eyes. At last, he had been given carte blanche to show the world what he was capable of. The village chosen was Lidice, on the outskirts of Prague. Why? Because the village's name had appeared in an intercepted love letter during the investigation, a tenuous, almost ridiculous connection. But it was enough. Frank wanted to make Lidice a symbol of his fury. On the morning of June 10, 1942, Frank arrived at the site. He climbed a nearby hill and, binoculars in hand, watched the mass execution. All the men and boys over the age of 15 were taken to a barn and shot in groups of 5. The women were forced to witness the massacre before being deported to Ravensbrück. The children were separated. Blonde children with light-colored eyes were sent for Nazi re-education. The rest were gassed at the Chełmno extermination camp. 4 pregnant women from Lidice were forced to undergo abortions at the hospital where Heydrich had died, a symbolic perversion that said everything about Frank. In all, 340 people were killed: 192 men, 60 women, and 68 children. The houses were burned, the gravestones torn out, and the ground plowed over. Frank ordered the name Lidice erased from every map, as if it had never existed. 2 weeks later, another village, Ležáky, was destroyed. The Gestapo had found a radio there used by the paratroopers. Its fate was the same. The 33 adults were shot, while the children were deported or Aryanized. More than 1,300 people were murdered in Frank's campaign of revenge. The Lidice massacre would become a symbol of Nazi barbarity around the world, and Frank walked impassively through the ruins he had authorized to be destroyed, declaring himself fully satisfied with the results. But even the most meticulous executioners cannot escape history. While he believed he had erased Lidice from memory, the world was beginning to write his name among the greatest monsters of the 20th century. If you want to follow more content like this, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. It helps us keep producing videos about such pivotal episodes in history. And if you would like more stories like that of Karl Hermann Frank, leave a comment below. I want more stories. Your support makes all the difference. Now, take a deep breath and let us follow the fate of one of Czechoslovakia's greatest war criminals. The fall of the Reich and justice, chaos and capture. In June 1943, when the Nazi war machine was already showing signs of strain, Karl Hermann Frank was promoted to SS Obergruppenführer, the second highest rank in the SS, equivalent to lieutenant general. It was a rare distinction, reserved only for the Reich's most loyal, efficient, and brutal servants. But the titles did not end there. Frank accumulated power like an emperor in the shadows. He also became general of police in Prague and a general in the Waffen-SS. In August of that same year, he was appointed Minister of State for the territories of Bohemia and Moravia. He was no longer merely the local enforcer of Nazi policy. He had become the absolute master of occupied Czechoslovakia. Among the Czechs, his name was no longer spoken without fear. They called him Frank the Bloody Dog, a nickname that was almost an honorary title to him. The sadist took pride in his reputation. He liked being feared and fed on the terror he spread. In 1944, as the Red Army advanced and local resistance grew stronger, Frank personally took command of an anti-partisan campaign in Moravia aimed at annihilating the NAZ1ST Brigade, the Protectorate's largest guerrilla unit. He mobilized 13,000 soldiers, emptied entire villages, and ordered summary executions on a single criterion: suspicion. On the 3rd of November 1944, he issued a macabre order. The bodies of those executed were to be hung in public for 48 hours. He turned repression into spectacle. Every hanged corpse was a message, every square a display case for terror. But even with all his power, Frank could not destroy the NAZ1ST Brigade. It held out until the final days of the war, living proof that courage can endure even under the rule of fear. In the spring of 1945, with Germany collapsing and Berlin under bombardment, the Bloody Dog tasted panic for himself. The man who had so often ordered deaths with indifference now trembled at the prospect of being captured by the Soviets. He knew that no mercy awaited him in the East, so, in one final act of cowardice, he abandoned Prague and tried to surrender to United States forces, hoping for more lenient treatment. But his crimes were too great and his name too well known. On the 9th of May, 1945, Frank was captured by American soldiers. Soon afterwards, he was extradited to Czechoslovakia, the very country he had ravaged, to be tried by the people he had sworn to exterminate. The trial took place between March and May of 1946, conducted by the Prague People's Court. It was not merely a legal proceeding, but a historical reckoning. No Czech lawyer wanted to defend Frank, not out of fear, but out of revulsion. Who would defend the Bloody Dog of Prague, responsible for deportations, expropriations, and deaths with the coldness of a bank clerk? In the end, Kamil Ressler, a jurist known for his integrity, accepted the case, not out of compassion, but out of principle. Even the most abhorrent men have the right to a fair trial. The press called him the devil's advocate. Frank tried to evade responsibility using the same arguments heard at the Nuremberg trials. He had merely followed orders, he claimed, and represented only a small part of the regime. He denied personally authorizing executions, even when confronted with documents bearing his signature. He even claimed that the massacres could be considered murders under human law, attempting to reduce genocide to bureaucracy and death to statistics. On the 21st of May, the People's Court sentenced Karl Hermann Frank to death by hanging for treason, genocide, and direct responsibility for the massacres at Lidice and Ležáky. Open wounds on the nation. It was the trial of a monster and the verdict of a country that had bled in silence for years. Prosecutor Jaroslav Drabek, who had lost friends and family, gave voice to his anguish. I, who had watched helplessly as Hitler exterminated my nation, suddenly had the power to make the guilty pay, and I did not tremble. Frank made a final appeal for clemency to President Edvard Beneš, but there was no response, only execution and reflection. At 1337, on the 22nd of May, 1946, Karl Hermann Frank was led to the gallows in the courtyard of Pankráč prison in Prague. He was 48 years old and carried a trail of blood stretching back almost a decade. Mass arrests, summary executions, deportations, villages destroyed. The architect of terror in Bohemia and Moravia took his final steps under the gaze of thousands. He faced the crowd without remorse, wearing pride in his crimes like armor. At the top of the platform, he shouted his final words: "Germany must live, even if we die. Long live the German nation! Long live the German spirit!" Blinded by fanatical devotion, he remained loyal to the end. The executioner carried out the hanging with precision. The trapdoor opened, and Frank fell, swinging in the middle of the courtyard like a broken marionette. He hung there for 45 minutes, as though death itself were contemplating terror finally defeated. He was buried anonymously in Jablitz Cemetery, a few meters from the graves of Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík. Karola was sent to a gulag in Kazakhstan for 10 years. She then spent 4 years trying to find her children, who had been raised under false identities. Frank's story reveals the banality of evil. He was not a madman, but a methodical, efficient, cold bureaucrat who used unlimited power to persecute and destroy. His story shows how authoritarianism first takes hold through words, then through decrees, lists, exclusions, and complicit silence, until a monster has a name, a face, and a machine at its disposal. Even the most brutal empire cannot escape justice. It may take time, demand sacrifices, and seem unlikely, but the day comes when the victims' names are remembered aloud, and the perpetrators are remembered not for glory, but for shame. Barbarism begins in silence and ends at the gallows, when humanity finally says, in the face of a murderer's death, "Never again." Did you already know the story of Karl Hermann Frank? Do you believe justice was done, or that no punishment could ever have been enough for the crimes committed? Leave your opinion in the comments. If you found this content interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That helps us keep telling stories that must never be forgotten. And before you go, take a look at the video now appearing on your screen. It is another dark chapter of the Second World War, and well worth watching. See you there.